Thanks very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's very exciting to be here because it's great to see the progress being made in preparation for the Congress next year. And even though the discussions have been going on only now for a year, 18 months, it seems that we've made good friends across the EuGMS with Greece, and now in the process of making good friends to all the Balkan countries. So I think we're very, very pleased with the way this is going. What I'm going to talk about today is some work that I've been involved in, but that's not the main point. The main point really is that this is work that potentially we could all be involved in over the next period of time. Because as you probably know, the WHO, the World Health Organization, will launch a decade of healthy aging next October. So that may give us opportunities to develop geriatric medicine within our health systems. So what I'm going to talk about is I'll just briefly touch on global aging and health to give the context for the WHO work. Describe a little about the aging report. In that, the key concepts, including intrinsic capacity, and then the overarching vision that's being promoted of integrated care for older people. And I'll give you some examples of what that means in practice, and then to look ahead to the decade of healthy aging and see what opportunities there may be for us. I don't have any commercial conflicts here, although I am involved in this work, so I have some professional interest in it. Now, at this point, may I ask, am I speaking at the right pace? Anyone think too fast? No. Good. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so we're all used to this notion of living longer. Actually, life expectancy has now plateaued in the United Kingdom, and we're not the only country where that's happened, actually. So over the last 2 or 3 years, life expectancy has plateaued. And so although there's still potential for living much longer, we look at international comparisons. We're beginning to sort of tail off, certainly in UK. As far as living healthy are concerned, well, I could show you data from anywhere really, but I'm just showing you this bit of data from a good quality study in England, which compared two populations of people over a period of just under 20 years, using the same sampling methodologies through primary care in 3 different cities in England. And it was part of a larger study looking at cognitive function and aging. But what it collected as part of that study was information on activities of daily living, disability. And what it showed is that from the age of 65, it gave you some figures about the number of years on average people lived with low dependency, that's care needed in their life, but less than daily. So that would generally be relatively low-level instrumental care. And then quite a few years of higher dependency, which was a bit surprising. Nearly 2 years on average, 1.3 to 1.9. But the important point was that between over the 20-year period, the amount of time for both low-level dependency and high-level dependency went up, demonstrating that we are not overall compressing morbidity, we're slightly stretching it. But another important finding here was that within the population, this increased years living with dependency was almost totally explained by people in the lower 50% of socioeconomic status, which is an important factor in terms of thinking about public health approaches. Now, if we look at dependency and unpick it a bit, what's its relation to, I go back to a very old paper, but I still think it gives a very important message from Thomas Gill and colleagues. And in brief, what this study did was it took a group of people at a cross-section who reported no disability, and then followed those people through time and identify those people who developed disability. and then ascribed an explanation for that. And what was important about that was that whereas about 50% of that incident disability was what we would now regard as associated with diagnosable multimorbidity or several conditions, medical conditions, about 50% wasn't. And this was before the word frailty was in our lexicon. It was before frailty was had been operationalized. But actually what it's really saying is that, isn't it? That there's disease non-specific changes that are significantly contributing to disability. And that's the key difference that has energized our move away from the disease era of medicine into the ones where we're beginning to think more about the range of age-related changes that have direct clinical consequence and therefore may become the direct substrate for our interventions rather than our interventions always being through the prism of diagnosed disease. So that's the big paradigm shift that we're part of. So we know that this is explained by older people living longer and having time to develop a number of changes, which I've illustrated here. Sarcopenia, which we now have operationalized quite well. Inflammaging, which is an important and well-accepted notion, although not yet operationalized in terms of specific numbers. Homeostatic dysregulation, which is a key feature that we were discussing earlier on today, the dysautonomia of the autonomic system and the way that contributes to changes in older age, and of course cognitive changes. So we know that these range of changes in older people are common and coexist very often with diagnosed diseases. Okay, now older people then end up in that situation very often if they don't die suddenly and usually prematurely, but that isn't random. And this diagram from the World Health Organization Aging Report of 2015 just illustrates, with using nice colors so you can see clearly, the contribution of so many different factors. Where we live, so the postcode is quite a good predictor of mortality, life expectancy, certainly in the UK. Health behaviours, access to health care, which is affected by health, but also affects health, and who we are in many other ways, our work experience, as well as our genetics. So all those factors play a part, and they play a part over time. So we've developed now, haven't we, a conviction of understanding old age from a life course perspective. And this illustrates this quite nicely and emphasizes the point that actually that if we look at this axis is normally from birth to death, but this actually is a slightly longer axis. This is looking at pre-birth across generations. And what we see here is that the chronic disease risk in the generation born at this point is affected, as we know now, by maternal issues and maternal conditions, as well as perinatal conditions, infancy, adolescence, and childhood. So we think of these trajectories from birth, in fact from conception, into old age. And we know that it's important to think of those trajectories both in terms of, as it were, what you might say peak performance, having an important effect on where you end up in older age, and the rate of change. Now, interestingly, recent data, which has not yet been published, that's emerging from the English longitudinal study of aging, tends to show that if you put age to one side and just look at the beginning of a trajectory of reducing function, the rate of reducing function is relatively unchanged across socioeconomic status. But what is different is the age it starts and the position it starts from. So therefore, the changes that contribute through the threshold effect into significant disability will be reached much quicker, not necessarily because of quicker decline, but because of a lower starting point and an earlier starting point. So, but anyway, this point is that we do think of these trajectories, and this is a high-risk trajectory and a low-risk trajectory, and we know that that's affected by every course within the life course, every point in time. So this is the kind of scientific sort of conceptual background to the WHO's life course approach. And this was one of the main emphasizing points of the report in 2015. May I just ask, would you mind putting your hand up if you've had a chance to actually read this report? Anyone? Okay. I think that would be, I think, fairly typical, and it would actually be typical if everybody in the audience was a card-carrying geriatrician as well. So in fact, it hasn't actually had very much traction really in the system yet and hasn't been widely read. In fact, I think, particularly for people coming into the field or younger people training in the field, it's a fantastic document because it gives a very good perspective on aging. It has enough of the biomedical aspects of aging to give it that type of meat, but it also talks quite importantly about the context in which older people are living and getting older. And so I think it's a really good general read. And within it, the other notable point is that it takes a new perspective on what we might call healthy aging. Now, many of you will remember the early concepts of healthy aging. One of the early discussions was the point made by Jack Rowe and Kahn 30 years ago now, differentiating within older people between successful aging and usual aging. The purpose of their papers in Science and in Gerontology were to emphasize the heterogeneity of aging and illustrate, therefore, perhaps the fact that many of the changes with older people were not necessarily inevitable. However, there was a wide discourse about this notion of successful aging, particularly from the social gerontology world, which found it critical, suggesting, therefore, that, in a sense, the only way to age successfully was to be biologically pristine, in good nick, in good condition, and that it took a rather different view. And the early sort of narrative of a different view was active aging, which was, in a sense, moving more towards the older person, not as somebody who had a heterogeneous variety of age-related changes, but as someone that was more or less participative in the community. So it took a sort of a citizen perspective. That also came under very heavy criticism over time, because the notion of active was interpreted often as economically active, in other words, as a consumer or something like that. And also by active meaning you could run a marathon as opposed to not run a marathon. And the other contributions that older people might make in terms of social relationships, wisdom, intergenerational support were kind of lost a bit. So the WHO thought it was useful to come up with a different conception of healthy aging. And what it focused on is here. I'll just... the process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being, healthy aging, well-being in the broadest sense, therefore not the absence of disease, and in other words, it's not, as it was before, the absence of disease plus something. It didn't include the absence of disease, okay? So it's broadest sense of happiness, satisfaction, fulfillment. And functional ability was defined in this way: the attributes that enable an individual to be or to do what they've reason to value. And this wording, slightly odd wording, but nevertheless, I think introduced a slightly different focus, and in particular the focus on functional ability in relation to what people want to be and what they want to do in their lives. Now, in this report, they emphasize that the contributing factors to functional ability are the relationship between all those attributes. We often think of them as mental and physical, don't we? Or attributes of an individual, mostly measurable attributes. All those attributes all working together in conjunction with living a life, i.e. having an environment and interacting with that environment. And so it defined that the things that you'd find in the individual as intrinsic capacities, and the environment, all those other factors, which includes, of course, health and social policy and culture and aging and so ageism and so on and so forth. So it emphasized those points and emphasized that the intrinsic capacity was also a complex product, as I've described before, of underlying age-related changes, health behaviors, diseases, injuries, and all the rest of it. So it basically said, okay, of course individual diagnosable conditions exist and play a part, but it's the sum total of their impacts and other age-related changes that provide the template, the intrinsic capacity, upon which somebody can draw to live their life in, and therefore contribute to their functional ability. Okay, so what are the important determinants of these intrinsic capacities? So I've said intrinsic capacity and all the physical and mental attributes, but what actually are the key mental and physical attributes? And obviously, to look at this, you have to draw on studies, either cross-sectional, but ideally longitudinal studies, that look at various attributes that individuals have, and then begin to see which of those are most predictive of the way people are functioning later on. And WHO commissioned some longitudinal studies and made some detailed analysis. And what's recently been published and contributed to the aging report in BMJ Open just very recently was a detailed analysis from the England longitudinal study of aging, but then looked at in other longitudinal studies for confirmation. So there was originally some principal factors analysis, quite complex statistical analysis, looking at factor composition of all those different variables that had been measured in the study to try and draw out clusters of parameters that could then be described as factors that travel together, and then confirm those principal those principal factors in a different data set. Okay, so first of all, there was an effort then in this analysis to factor in multimorbidity. Let's say, for the purpose of argument, that's a count of diseases, ADL function, other attributes of the individual, their sex, age, education level, wealth, and so on. There was an attempt to try and relate all these different things and see whether, in particular, how these things operated. They obviously some of these things operate through different incidents of multimorbidity, but they also operate through different measurable characteristics here. And of course, that's the proximate way that function is changed. Function is not directly changed by disease, it's changed by the proximate alteration in attributes. So how did it end up in that analysis? Well, it ended up with these factors being the most important factors contributing to the sum total of intrinsic capacity. Vitality, which is quite difficult to define, but includes things like nutrition and also strength, locomotor function, cognition, and that's not dementia or not. That's a variety of ways of looking at different ranges of cognition, hearing and seeing, and also psychosocial function, which again was not depression or not, but was mild depressive symptoms or anxiety, which, as you know, can become quite common in older people, particularly older people who are not very well. So these are the factors that came out of that analysis. And at the moment, there's some work going on trying to say, well, are these apples and pears? Can you add them up and give this fruit a number? And is that conceptually valid, and is it actually operationally possible? And there's quite a lot of work going into that at the moment. And I think the general impression for the people doing that work at the moment is that it probably is. And what that really means in practice is that if you add together those attributes and you get a score of intrinsic capacity, it may not matter how you get to that score in terms of your likelihood of disability, institutionalization, hospitalization. There are obviously some exceptions to the rule. If you have a massive stroke and everything else is perfectly good, you're in trouble. But if you take it at a population level, it may be that it is the sum total rather than the particularities that are most important. And that means that if you take a public health approach, one needs to take an approach that's across all these factors within intrinsic capacity. And of course, different people will be amenable to different interventions, but it means that interventions in any of those are potentially useful. Okay. They looked at longitudinal studies to see if they could then go back to the data with a figure, with a way of measuring intrinsic capacity, and look at what were the levels of intrinsic capacity measured in a series of studies. And in particular, this was a global study of aging. And what it shows here in this data is that the composite score, which at that stage was rather provisional, and the age, you can see that the red and blue are the traditional attributes of male and female. There was a massive variation, although a general decline with years, a massive variation in these things in the studies. You could look at the mean, and on the mean you had a group of people who were high and stable. That was the predominant experience in early life. Slight declining capacity of intrinsic capacity, and then a period of more rapid decline. Reflected by functional ability, but less so because of the mitigating effect of the environment, so that the bigger change in intrinsic capacity don't necessarily directly relate to the same magnitude of functional ability change. Now, this does provide a structure for a public health and a clinical approach, and this was what was described in the Aging report. And I'll show you schematically then. This is a diagram from the report. And what this shows, again, is these lines that I've just shown you. And what it describes is that during this period of high and stable capacity, obviously the tasks in a society are to prevent chronic conditions if one can, and the health service may have a role in that by early detection. But more importantly, a major effect of the environment, promoting capacity-enhancing situations rather than unenhancing. And that's as much to do with your work experience and your environment as it is with your personal health behaviours. During the period of declining capacity and significant loss, they proposed an approach called ICOPE, which is integrated care of older people. And this is not particularly novel, but it conceptualized a gradual change towards reversing or slowing declines in capacity, towards a time later on where you're maybe managing advanced clinical conditions, and also a phase later on in life with long-term care where enhancing dignity in late life becomes predominantly more important. So it kind of gives you a rough schema, but to get a little bit more specific than that, the potential uses of intrinsic capacity are at least these. The first thing to do is that it gives a new way of measuring what you might call the global burden of disease. Now, we've had studies of global burden of disease. So we know, for example, that within Europe, I think it's something like 80% of the global of the explicable disability is associated with non-communicable diseases. Okay. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say all the variability in disability is explained by disease counts, because I've already said that's only part of the explanatory factors. But it gives you, measuring intrinsic capacity gives you a new way of describing health of populations. And there's a lot of work going on to say, well, if that's the case, are there routine data sets that align to the intrinsic capacity notion? What metrics should be used to describe it? And that work's ongoing at the World Health Organization. The second way it can be used is to do that, but look at cohort trends, because clearly cohorts of older people coming through their lives are different. And we could potentially observe differences between one generation and the other. Thirdly, trajectories. And let me just explain a bit about what I mean there. If you look at these, you can imagine 5 quintiles of decline of intrinsic capacity, okay? This may, particularly for the paediatricians amongst you, look familiar, because we're aware of that with the length. This is age, and this is the length of boys, and quintiles. And any of you with children or grandchildren will know that there is often talk about quintiles, you know, and in particular if people go off their predicted curve based on their quintile, that's often cause for concern. So if somebody's here on this good quintile, but moves to that quintile, it's not regarded in child health as that's okay, you're still above 50%. It's regarded as a change from your predictive trajectory, which might therefore be important. So it's a novel way of describing change in individuals. So they look pretty familiar, don't they? So that gives you, that's theoretically at least, a new way of looking at change over time. Okay, now, the other one is stratification to target groups and focusing for assessment and outcomes on intrinsic capacity. And significant progress has been made. First of all, a handbook has been produced just recently, published on October the 1st, of guidance on person-centered assessment. And what this describes is reasonably practical ways of assessing capacity in all of those factors, those domains that I described. And that's linked then to recommendations to manage those factors of intrinsic capacity. And this again has just recently been written up, the justification and the methodology, which is actually quite rigorous in PLOS medicine, but it was published as a guidance from the WHO a couple of years ago. And the actions take place across these factors: musculoskeletal functional mobility, capacity to see and hear, and so on. And I won't go into detail for reasons of time. Now, how's this going in terms of implementation? These are early days. First of all, there's work going on internationally to say, if we actually look at data sets that we've got in other countries, and you try and look at the data and translate it into intrinsic capacity factors, does it make sense? Is it doable? And does it actually have the predictiveness that the model would suggest? And that work is, at the moment, looking quite optimistic, and there's ongoing work, particularly looking at the health and retirement study family of studies. Secondly, there's pilot intervention studies. In India, there's one in clinical population in Delhi, and the other one, which is probably more appropriate, in community-based clinics run by people who are not highly trained health professionals. Okay? They're not geriatricians. They're people who can be trained to do this assessment of intrinsic capacity. Also work going on in China. Very, very interesting work going on in the Kanagawa region just outside Tokyo in Japan, where they've combined this with an already existing health program and incorporated the notion of intrinsic capacity. And there's a pilot study planned in Thailand. So I think in 2 years from now, we will be much further ahead in terms of understanding these challenges. What are the challenges? Well, if you're going to target a bit of population that you're not targeting that you're not targeting on the basis of diagnosis, how do you do it? How do you fit it into your present systems? How feasible is the assessment? What about the issues that concern people that are not included, like pain and sleep? And then, of course, the training factors. Now, this is all going into the decade of older people, and there's been quite a lot of work over the last couple of years doing this. And the emphasis here on aligning health systems to the needs of older people. One of the three emphasis here is orientating systems around intrinsic capacity and putting that in the context of an integrated approach to older people. Now, the Decade of Healthy Aging is starting 2020 on October. It'll be launched. 3 main action areas: age-friendly communities, person-centered integrated care based around these concepts, and a community-based social care and support. And each of them has got a series of actions which have got opportunities for us, geriatricians, both at the level of the community and beyond, adopting and implementing guidelines and getting them into practice, but also participating in campaigns with other players within our countries and internationally. So the opportunities then are to support this new paradigm, support the need for age-attuned healthcare, which is emphasised by the WHO report, and create a platform which will be created by WHO to work nationally and regionally with other organisations. And what geriatric medicine has got to offer in this notion is going to be really, really important. So I see this as a great opportunity. Thank you.